Late August 2005. In the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, people are leaving their homes in droves, as just to their south, a powerful Category 5 hurricane named Katrina was knocking on their doorsteps. Swirling above the hot waters of the Gulf, she was looking to make history. Of course, some didn't leave, either because they couldn't, or because they believed it was going to be just like the multiple other near misses they've had since Betsy and Camille. It was just going to be like Ivan the year prior again. Sadly, they would end up being wrong. Katrina slammed into the coastlines of Louisiana and Mississippi, bringing high winds and a record-shattering storm surge across those who were in her path. The day of landfall, the majority of the attention was on the direct coastlines of the states aforementioned, an extreme level of devastation to the coastline that hadn't been seen since Hurricane Camille in 1969. The attention quickly shifted to the disaster in New Orleans, the city with a population of around 500,000 at the time, that was in the midst of one of the worst humanitarian crises in US history. Quickly, those hit hard outside of the New Orleans area started to feel like they were being ignored. Sure, they were receiving support and getting some attention, but all eyes were on New Orleans. To this day, Katrina is primarily discussed for its impacts on New Orleans and the metro, and really only New Orleans for most people. It's like those outside of the big city were forgotten about. However, overlooking the disaster along the coastline in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama is a disservice not only to those who passed away, but to the hurricane's legacy. Today, I am beginning a journey to remake the original video on Katrina that I made in 2022. Except instead of it being one giant mess of pacing, it will be a long-term project. This video is the first in a series talking about Katrina, with the next one being focused solely on New Orleans and the New Orleans metro. But today, I will be talking about the overshadowed stories from Katrina, the impacts brought to those outside of New Orleans, with a primary focus on the direct coastlines of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. I will be covering the synopsis, the preparations, the history of storms in the region, the storm's landfalls, the aftermath and response, and how the areas are doing today. Welcome to Nature's Fury. Katrina's origins were complex, forming due to interactions between a tropical wave, the remnants of Tropical Depression 10, and an upper-level trough. The wave left the coast of Africa on August 11th and moved across the main development region of the Atlantic. On the 14th, a strong upper-level trough produced strong westerly shear that tore Tropical Depression 10 apart, with the mid-level circulation lagging behind and eventually merging with the tropical wave. The wave continued to produce showers and thunderstorms while moving to the northwest of the islands of Hispaniola. The trough began to weaken, and with less shear, the system began to develop and was designated as Tropical Depression 12 at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 23rd, and designated as Tropical Storm Katrina at 11 a.m. the next day. With Florida and the Bahamas under the gun, people began to prepare. Katrina slowly developed as it came under the influence of a strengthening mid to upper level ridge over the northern Gulf and the southern United States, steering the storm westward. NHC forecasts at the time had the storm making landfall in South Florida and then curving up to the north and into the Florida Panhandle come August 29th. Katrina made landfall in southern Florida between Hallandale Beach and Aventura at around 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 25th as a Category 1 hurricane, producing over a foot of rain across portions of Miami-Dade County as it slowly trekked over the state, emerging over the Gulf at roughly 1 a.m. on August 26th. By the time it had left the state of Florida, it had already killed 12. The storm began to slowly strengthen once more, limited by an eyewall replacement cycle before it exploded in intensity, strengthening from a tropical storm to a Category 2 hurricane between the 26th and the 27th. But it was also during this time when the forecast began to change. It kept shifting to the west. Early on the 26th, the center of the forecast cone had Katrina over the western part of the Florida Panhandle. At the 5 p.m. advisory, it had Louisiana and Mississippi dead in its sights. Then, just a day and a half after Katrina had her eyes set on her target, On the morning of the 28th, it rapidly intensified once more to its peak strength, a Category 5 hurricane with winds of 175 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 902 millibars, becoming the most intense hurricane in the Gulf by pressure on record at the time, until Hurricane Rita less than a month later. With no signs of it stopping or shifting anywhere else, it had the coasts of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama on high alert. People quickly began to take action, even before the storm reached its peak intensity. Across the Gulf Coast, local and state officials began to prepare for the storm ahead of its eventual landfall. Let's go over this state by state so it's organized and so I'm not jumping back and forth between states. Starting in Alabama, preparations began 5 days before landfall, as Baldwin and Mobile counties began regular consultations with the NWS and Alabama's EMA to discuss the likely path, with information given to all local officials and first responders, and staff prepared to activate the Emergency Operations Centers, or EOCs. On Friday the 26th, a state of emergency was declared to handle what was thought to be a surge of evacuees from the Florida Panhandle. Governor Bill Riley visited all of the counties that are located next to the Gulf and held numerous press conferences to urge local residents to evacuate. By the 27th, a Level 1 response was activated with the EOC in full force. However, a FEMA emergency response team was on site late in the day. Alabama's EMA was somewhat frustrated as a result. President George W. Bush called Governor Riley to ensure the governor had everything he needed, and the governor's staff indicated that they felt better prepared for Katrina than they did for Dennis and Ivan. On the 28th, Governor Riley wrote to President Bush asking for an emergency disaster declaration, which was done the same day. The next day, Governor Riley wrote to President Bush to ask him to declare an expedited major disaster declaration, which was declared on the same day. The state also used the EM 2000 incident log in their preparations. After Hurricane Ivan, the state upgraded their tracking system to determine hospital bed vacancies, giving state officials real-time visibility of surge capacity and making it possible to better direct those with special medical needs to appropriate sites. Preparations in Mississippi indirectly began much earlier. During the summer, the director of the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, or MEMA, Robert Latham, his key staff, and most of the state's emergency management directors underwent training in the National Incident Management System. FEMA officials also underwent the same training. Two officials who would lead the federal response in Mississippi, Bill Carwile and Robert Fenton, said after the fact that their training in ICS allowed them to quickly establish a unified command. On August 23rd, the state issued its first Hurricane Katrina situation report, and it was monitored through the 25th. During this time, MEMA conducted executive planning sessions to develop an EOC activation timeline, as well as plans for protective actions and a proactive response, while also establishing contact with the FEMA Logistics Cell and encouraging the public to prepare for the storm. Come the next day, the State National Guard was activated, reporting to and responding to mission assignments given by MEMA. The National Guard had an operations plan that was used during Katrina. On the 27th, MEMA activated its EOC, sending county liaisons to 6 counties and activating its state emergency response team for deployment to Camp Shelby. FEMA's liaison arrived at the state's EOC on the 27th, and FEMA's Emergency Response Team A arrived on the same day. FEMA was deploying resources to a regional mobilization center in Selma, Alabama, and MEMA stated that FEMA would be able to supply large quantities of water and ice to the hardest hit areas. MEMA encouraged coastal counties to evacuate north instead of going to local shelters, describing them as a place of last resort. The State Guard accelerated its preparations, alerting state emergency personnel to assemble for hurricane operations under Joint Task Force Magnolia, assembling and prepositioning all 3 coastal county EOCs into its special hurricane strike squads. The assets were sufficient for a Category 2 hurricane, but as Katrina continued to intensify, they began requests for assistance via the EMAC. Come the 28th, following a request from Governor Haley Barbour, President Bush issued an emergency declaration for Mississippi, with a major disaster declaration coming the day after. Shelters began to open and were on standby, In total, there were 57 shelters open with 7,610 people registered in them. In Louisiana, the state's EOC began running communication checks with state agencies and parishes on August 25th, and was fully up and running by the afternoon of the 26th. The state EOC would begin holding regular conference calls with all state agencies, key parishes, federal agencies, other states, and the Red Cross to coordinate pre-landfall activities. Supplies and boats were pre-positioned at the Jackson Barracks, with the expectation of flooding occurring in New Orleans. The State National Guard began being mobilized and provided general support for security. On the 27th, contraflow evacuations began and orders started being issued. Evacuations began with the southernmost parishes and slowly went north, with contraflow being done to evacuate as many people as they could. At the parish level, many local officials took action ahead of the storm. Plaquemines Parish parked vehicles on high ground, gathered records and moved them north, transferred prisoners to upstate facilities out of harm's way, and set up an emergency command post in a local high school. Jefferson Parish implemented their doomsday plan, hunkering down in their EOC with a skeleton crew to minimize damages to staff. Parishes also worked with non-governmental organizations, mainly local churches and the Red Cross, to help evacuate residents who didn't have their own vehicles. Across all regions, residents stocked up on supplies, boarded up windows, and left if they could, or hunkered down if they couldn't. If you are wondering about what actions were taken in New Orleans specifically, I'll cover that in the next video in this series when I talk about Katrina's impacts to the city in general. But not everyone left. And while a vast majority of those who didn't leave couldn't do so even if they wanted to, especially in New Orleans, it's also important to analyze why those who willingly stayed behind did. And for the most part, it boils down to previous storm experience. Many immediately point out how those who were older stayed behind because they survived Camille. That is avoiding the much bigger issue, which is that the region had been extremely lucky with storms in the 36 years between Camille and Katrina. When looking at why those who had the ability to evacuate stayed, the main focus is on Hurricane Camille. However, looking back at the history of tropical cyclones in this region, the general area had been subjected to numerous close calls from multiple hurricanes between Camille and Katrina, and even before then with other storms. In this segment, I'm gonna focus on storms that got really close to causing absolute destruction, and the two that ended up doing so. I'm looking for named storms that were of notable strength, or produced rainfall of over a foot. To be fair, flash flooding and minor coastal flooding is nothing new for this region. The general elevation of this area ranges from 5 feet below sea level and 30 feet above. However, it's important to mention that a good majority of flooding was caused by high rainfall totals rather than storm surge. At least in the majority of cases where notable flooding occurred, with 2 obvious exceptions. Between 1950 and Katrina, most storms that impacted this region between the New Orleans metro and Mobile, Alabama, either weren't much to write home about or were significant because of the flooding due to excessive rainfall. Of the storms that occurred, they can be put into one of 4 categories. The first of which are storms that are minimal hurricanes or tropical storms, where the damages weren't really notable, or caused primarily by flooding due to excessive rainfall. Those being Hurricanes Flossie in 1956, Hilda in 1964, Juan of 1985, Danny of 1997, and Tropical Storm Matthew in 2004. Of those, Hurricane Flossie was one of the more significant ones from a storm surge perspective. The second group of storms are ones that were predicted to bring major impacts only to weaken or take a drastically different path when it made landfall. Those being Ethel 1960, Carmen 1974, Georges 1998, Isidore 2002, and Ivan 2004. I'll talk about Ivan in depth in a little bit. The third group is similar, but they were much closer to causing major devastation. Those being Elena 1985 and Andrew in 1992. Before I talk about the fourth group, which are the 2 exceptions to all of this, I want to discuss Elena, Andrew, and Ivan before I talk about them. Hurricane Elena in 1985 mostly affected areas in coastal Alabama, with 6 to 8 feet of surge in portions of Mississippi. Despite making direct landfall in Mississippi and then proceeding to get really close to New Orleans, the storm wasn't worse thanks in part to its small size. Then there was Hurricane Andrew. While many remember it for its impacts it brought to southern Florida as a Category 5 hurricane, the storm kept going after that, and aimed straight for Louisiana. The storm was seen as a potential worst-case scenario before its landfall, with the potential to completely devastate the coastal parishes in southeast Louisiana, and also overtake the levees in New Orleans. Andrew, despite getting really close to the southeastern coastal parishes in Louisiana, didn't really impact the region much because it was a small and compact storm, and most of the damages ended up coming from the central coastline. But just a year before Katrina, there was Hurricane Ivan. While it was still in the Caribbean, the cone of uncertainty included areas from southeastern Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle. Many in Mississippi and Louisiana voluntarily evacuated, with many fearing the catastrophic flooding it could bring, which it didn't. Regardless, the evacuation effort in Louisiana ended up being a mess as traffic jams were constant on the highways. Many in Mississippi evacuated as well, with people from both regions coming back to see that the worst of the storm was far away from them in Alabama and Florida. Then there's the fourth group, the two hurricanes that caused catastrophic damage to the coastlines of Mississippi and southeastern Louisiana. Late on September 9th, 1965, Hurricane Betsy came ashore in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, with peak winds of 140 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 942 millibars. The levees near the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans failed. It wasn't much better in Mississippi. 7 to 15 feet of surge lashed at the coastline, hitting the region pretty hard. But then there was the big one, Camille. Camille was an extraordinarily powerful Category 5 hurricane that struck the Gulf Coast of the United States in 1969, crashing ashore in Waveland, Mississippi at 11:30 p.m. Central Daylight Time on August 19th at peak intensity, with maximum sustained winds of 175 miles per hour and an atmospheric pressure of 900 millibars. The second strongest storm to ever hit the United States mainland in both wind speed and pressure, with the only storm ahead of it being the 1935 Labor Day hurricane. Camille was a storm that brought utter hell wherever she went, destroying practically everything on the coastal parishes in Louisiana, and bringing storm surge between 20 to 25 feet to Mississippi, wiping out mass swaths of land, and killing 137 in that state alone. As a tropical depression, the storm produced significant flooding in Virginia, killing anywhere between 113 and 154 people, although sources conflict on the exact number. Camille was the worst hurricane the country had seen in a long time, and its impacts were far-reaching. Besides the obvious two exceptions, the reason why major impacts weren't seen from the majority of systems that came through was because they were weak tropical cyclones. But what about those that had the strength but didn't produce much surge in the region anyway, comparatively speaking given their strength? Mainly Elena and Andrew. It's because they were small, compact systems with a pretty high pressure given their strength. Alongside geography, but I'll talk about that in a moment. I already talked about storm size and its relation to storm surge when I covered Hurricane Ian. As a refresher, the reason why the surge was larger and more widespread during Ian than it was during Charlie, despite making landfall at the exact same strength and pressure at nearly the exact same spot, was due in part to Ian being nearly double the size of Charlie. Storm motion also played a part, but not as much as the storm size. More often than not, storm surge is impacted by a storm's overall size. Mostly. Elena, despite making landfall near Gulfport as a major hurricane, was quite small. The highest winds were recorded from Biloxi through Dolphin Island, Alabama. Similarly, Andrew, while it made landfall further away from where Elena did, was a small, compact system that spared southeastern Louisiana. Katrina ended up being a large storm with a massive wind field. A storm's atmospheric pressure is another major factor. The lower the pressure, the less force that the air is putting on the water. Elena's pressure at landfall was 959 millibars, and Andrew's was 956. Katrina's pressure at both landfalls ended up being sub 930. But then there's the issue that I alluded to mentioning soon. An area's local geography is also extremely important. This region of the Gulf Coast that Katrina hit is one of the most storm surge prone areas in the entire country. It turns out that not a lot of storms took advantage of that geography between Camille and Katrina. There are other factors, but TLDR, for a worst-case scenario, you need a storm with a very low pressure, a large wind field, and an area that is extremely prone to storm surge, and a storm that takes advantage of that geography. And as it turns out, Katrina fit that bill. So, when residents get missed time and time again from what is supposed to be the big one, it shouldn't be surprising that they would be skeptical when a storm actually comes by that has a legitimate threat of wrecking everything. Yes, I'm fully aware that you can't compare storms to each other, but I feel like that doesn't matter in this context. It's human nature to try and compare a threat to something similar to it, and at the end of the day, it's an individual's decision to decide whether or not to act. And previous experience of similar events will often be a major deciding factor as to how to respond to a given scenario, natural disaster or not. The lack of major storms hitting this specific area of the Gulf Coast between Camille and Katrina left people feeling like it was just going to be another Ivan, which ended up playing a major role in those who consciously decided to stay behind even if they could evacuate on their own. Regardless of their decisions, many went to bed on the night of August 28, 2005, expecting Katrina to just be another hurricane. Something that wasn't going to rival the damage and destruction caused by Betsy and Camille. Little did they know that no matter how much they prepared, nobody was ready for what Katrina was about to unleash on the coast. After reaching its peak intensity, Katrina began to turn northward under the influence of the ridge that steered it into Florida, and underwent an eyewall replacement cycle. However, the situation for the storm was getting worse synoptically. Ocean heat content was on a decline, and wind shear was picking up. The southern side of the eyewall began to decay, as dry air moved into the center. She was on a weakening course as she moved towards the Gulf Coast. While that was true, it didn't mean that she wasn't a beast to deal with. The weakening up until landfall was mainly due to structural changes, but that rapid change in wind speed was not reflected in its pressure. While it rose, it was still incredibly low, reminiscent of a Category 4 or 5 hurricane, and then, early in the morning, during high tide, its first landfall in Louisiana. At 6:10 a.m. Central Daylight Time on August 29th, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near Burr's Triumph in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. As a Category 3 hurricane with winds of 125 miles per hour, and an astonishingly low pressure of 920 millibars. To put in perspective as to how absurdly low that is, Hurricane Ida, which struck roughly the same area in 2021, had winds of 150 miles per hour and a pressure of 931 millibars. The low pressure of Katrina was the true sign of her strength, despite what the wind speeds may suggest. The storm ripped apart the small towns located along the Mississippi River, with the high winds and surge overtopping the man-made levees. As the storm continued northward, storm surge of 15 to 19 feet battered the eastern coastline of Louisiana as it moved closer and closer to its second target. While most of Louisiana's easternmost parishes are sparsely populated wetlands, the same could not be said for the next target in its path, the coastline of Mississippi. Just a few hours later, Katrina made landfall near the Louisiana-Mississippi state line, and the scene was utter chaos. On the coastline of Mississippi, 17 to 22 feet of storm surge rushed inland from Gulfport to Pascagoula, and 24 to 28 feet of surge in a 20-mile swath centered on St. Louis Bay, including the communities of Waveland, Bay St. Louis, Pass Christian, and Long Beach. The high water mark observed at Pass Christian was 27.8 feet. The only storms in recent memory to have a storm surge that was either close to or exceeded that height was Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 and Cyclone Nargis in 2008. The storm surge this time, unlike with Haiyan, was mainly so high due to the overall size of Katrina. In combination with the strong winds, those who stayed for the storm struggled to stay alive or died trying. Boarded up windows didn't matter either. They were ripped off in the wind with the glass shattering alongside it. But the surge was the deadly killer. As 20 to 28 feet of surge roared into the coastline of Mississippi, just about everything in its path close to the coastline was pushed off of their foundations, with the water storming 6 to 12 miles inland. An absolutely insane statistic that is hard to even comprehend. Things weren't much better in Alabama, which got hit hard the year prior by Hurricane Ivan. 10 to 15 feet of surge crashed onto the southern shore, with the highest amount being on Dolphin Island. Katrina was now ashore, but her fury still continued as she moved inland. As Katrina moved over land, it began to rapidly weaken, but the storm was still dangerous. Katrina's large wind field contributed to strong winds far away from its center. The end result was the state of Alabama having one of its worst power outages from a storm in their history. 656,000 customers were without power across the entire state. The situation was worse in Mississippi. The high winds and fallen trees left more than 900,000 people in the state without power, which included 97% of the Jackson, Mississippi metro area on the first night after the storm. While Katrina weakened, it brought a noticeable flooding threat to the southeastern United States through the Ohio River Valley and into Canada. Many areas received at least an inch of rain, with localized areas of over 5 inches of rainfall across most of Mississippi, portions of Kentucky, and the Appalachian Mountains. Tornadoes were also an issue. A total of 57 touched down in the United States from August 26th through the 31st, most of them touching down in the state of Georgia on August 29th. Katrina holds the record for the most tornadoes spawned in the state of Georgia during a 24-hour period in August. The strongest of these tornadoes were rated F2. Katrina weakened to a tropical storm as it passed through Meridian, and turned northeast after interacting with a trough to its north. The lack of warm ocean water and the continuously increasing shear would cause the storm to weaken further, with Katrina dissipating over central Ohio on August 31st and being absorbed into the trough. However, the damage left behind on the coastline ended up being some of the most extreme hurricane damage seen in the United States in recent memory. The horrific damage began in the loosely populated towns in the easternmost parishes in Louisiana. The small, unincorporated community of Pilot Town was wiped out. The town remains abandoned to this day. A little bit to the northwest were the towns of Boothville and Venice. Both were torn apart. The levees in Venice were practically useless as the storm surge flooded the town, pushed boats inland, and wrecked oil platforms near the town. Neighborhoods located in Boothville were inundated with surge, and 2 weeks after the storm, streets remained underwater. Burris' triumph, where the storm initially made landfall, was leveled. The town's water tower crashed down to the surface. Buildings were left badly damaged and became unlivable, and tombs in the town's cemetery were not spared either. All across Empire, Louisiana, boats plagued the waters nearby, as well as the city streets themselves, assuming the streets weren't flooded or littered with debris. Homes in Port Sulphur were hit so badly that the homes drifted away from their foundations due to the storm surge. The water was covered in debris and oil. Other small communities in the wetlands outside of New Orleans, such as Reggio, Wood Lake, Delacroix, Shell Beach, and Hopedale, were devastated. Docks near Slidell, Louisiana, near the northern side of Lake Pontchartrain, were ripped apart. Homes were badly damaged, and a car near a car wash was left crushed up like someone had stepped on it. Trees upon trees and forests nearby were forcefully pushed down by the wind. The damage across all of coastal and inland Louisiana was extreme. And then there was Mississippi.
Hurricane Katrina, a most powerful hurricane with unprecedented strength, rivaling the intensity of Hurricane Camille of 1969. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. Airborne debris will be widespread, and may include heavy items such as household appliances and even light vehicles. Sport utility vehicles and light trucks will be moved. The blown debris will create additional destruction. Persons, pets, and livestock exposed to the winds will face certain death if struck. Power outages will last for weeks, as most power poles will be down and transformers destroyed. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards.
Across the entire length of the state coastline, all 44 miles of it, there was practically nothing left. Sure, some areas were hit harder than others, but that doesn't do it justice. The damage done to coastal Mississippi due to the highest storm surge ever seen in the continental United States in modern times is some of the worst, if not the worst damage done to coastal communities in this country by a hurricane in recent memory. Other storms have come close, but the damage left behind in coastal Mississippi looks like you took a 6-mile wide EF3 tornado and dragged it across the shoreline. The town of Pearlington, while not directly on the coastline, was where Katrina made its final landfall. The small town is located along the Pearl River at the state line with Louisiana. It was so small that it wasn't even labeled on maps at the time. Nobody really knew the town existed. Well, until Katrina. Despite not being directly on the coast, the high surge translated to roughly 20 feet of water rushing into the small community through the Pearl River. The result? Only 2 buildings in town survived relatively unscathed. Residents returned to find their homes torn apart into shreds, or gone entirely. The Charles B. Murphy Elementary School was damaged beyond repair, with evidence of the storm's fury inside the building ever so apparent. Several sick and elderly residents were trapped in their homes for around 2 days before state police got to the town. The storm worsened the already struggling population, where 1/5 of the population being below the poverty line. The storm left a bad-smelling deposit, with elevated levels of arsenic detected in the town. Also not helping, due to the poor sewage management and frequent well flooding, the town was at an elevated risk of the wells being contaminated with bacteria. 3 weeks after the storm, MEDQ surveyed wells in Pearlington, and found that 1/3 of them in town were contaminated with coliform bacteria. Then there's the stretch between Waveland and Pass Christian, considered to be ground zero for Katrina in Mississippi. In Waveland, there's no words to adequately describe the damage, where the near 30-foot storm surge went 6 to 12 miles inland. It looked like a giant EF3 twister roared across the city, but it wasn't a tornado. It was the force of water. From the air, the foundations of homes were left visible with bits of debris scattered all across town. 95% of Waveland was completely destroyed. Christy Verdon and her family returned from Panama City, Florida to see their home was completely gone. Maureen Burnett ran to rescue workers to have them help find her mother as she saw her mother's red Ford Focus. The family dog, Buddy, found her mother's body. She was dead. Some, such as Susie DiStefano, didn't find her mother's body until 6 weeks after Katrina made landfall, according to NBC News. The nearby city of Bay St. Louis was in a similar state. The bridge on US Highway 90, destroyed, looking like someone took a knife and chopped it up into individual pieces. Looking closer to the shoreline, roads were turned into broken pieces of asphalt. Buildings were obliterated left and right, with many locations just left as giant piles of debris. Houses were swept away and off of their foundations, causing them to have partial collapses of some walls at best, or left with completely nothing at worst. No matter where you went, all that surrounded you was the total and complete destruction of buildings and trees. The Hancock Medical Center, the only hospital in town, badly damaged, offering limited services through tents in the parking lot. Pass Christian, leveled. The town's mayor, Billy McDonald, met with a dazed police officer and was told that he was the mayor of nothing. The town was turned into one massive landfill of debris. The town's police department, gone, with operations being conducted out of what was left of a Shell gas station. The historic scene district, all that were left were the trees. The houses were gone. Random houses stood where they were while others nearby were gone entirely, and a school bus was moved into a ditch next to the railroad. Long Beach, which lies between Pass Christian and Gulfport, flattened. Debris sprawled about with homes flattened and gone. In one neighborhood, every house except for one was torn apart by the surge. and an apartment building nearby was left partially standing, but you could see the massive pile behind it. Shredded wood, window seals, vehicles, and parts of homes still intact that were pushed away from where they once stood. In other neighborhoods, only the concrete and brick foundations were all that remained of homes. Gulfport, the second most populous city in the entire state, was completely unrecognizable. Homes in a family housing area on board the Naval Construction Battalion Center were pushed off of their foundations and slammed into homes further inland. Landmarks and locations left unrecognizable, with some places only identifiable by a parking lot still standing. Roads were just littered with debris. Boats were thrown inland and remained on dry land. One of those, ironically, was the SS Hurricane Camille. The Grand Casino Gulfport Hotel was left standing, but badly damaged. The bridge that led to the casino, gone. The marine life aquarium was overtaken by water, with waves so high that it washed out several dolphins that were in the facility into the Gulf of Mexico. Many were left in shock. A 5-year-old boy was found on the steps of an office building. His grandparents found dead, with his mother and 8-year-old brother still missing, according to the New York Times. The County seat, just nearby, Biloxi, was in a similar state. Boats that normally floated off of the shipping docks were missing or found inland. 2 of the barges belonging to the Grand Casino Biloxi were now inland, forced over the highway and onto the foundations of former homes. The smaller of the barges landed close to the Tivoli Hotel. The barge slammed and destroyed an apartment building next to it, where 15 people sought shelter, resulting in the deaths of 9 people. The President Casino, similarly, was thrown inland by the surge, laying aground against a Holiday Inn. The Palace Casino riverboat partially sunk, with the upper floors being visible and the bridge in front completely destroyed. The Treasure Bay Casino was ripped apart. The ship, which is where the casino was located, utterly devastated. The front of the Hard Rock Casino was left barely intact, but dangerous to a point where it needed to be demolished. The Qatar sign outside still stood. The barge itself was completely destroyed and laid lifeless above the water. At another casino resort, the parking garage had collapsed into the seawater, and high-rise buildings left and right suffered from damage in one way or another. The Broadwater Marina turned into twisted pieces of debris. The J.L. Scott Marine Education Center and Aquarium was swept clean in its entirety. A local water park, completely obliterated. Biloxi Harbor Bait and Fuel was turned into nothing more than sharp pieces of metal. Churches, such as this one, were only identifiable by its frame. Nearby laid a construction crane just west of Edgewater Mall. What was once towering in the air now crashed down on the ground. At the Great Southern Golf Club, a clubhouse collapsed onto itself. The Edgewater Mall was left still standing, although it did suffer severe damage. Asphalt was broken into pieces, and across neighborhood after neighborhood, you could see staircases leading to nothing, with the homes they led to being pushed off of their foundations, left somewhat intact or left as pieces of bricks and wood. Although some oddities remained. Well, more so one. The marina at Beau Rivage Hotel and Casino, made mostly out of wood, somehow survived the storm intact. The casino stayed in place, but the storm surge and waves gutted it from the inside out. The damage wasn't as severe as you went further inland, but it was obvious that Katrina caused any and all damage that laid there. The town's lighthouse, located right in front of the beaches, survived the devastating surge, remaining as a primary symbol of hope for the Gulf Coast. The bridge from Biloxi to Ocean Springs was twisted and destroyed in a way that can't really be described. The concrete split in ways like someone crushed it and just meshed it up together. Ocean Springs wasn't in much better shape. Debris littered the landscape from damaged and destroyed homes. In Pascagoula, houses turned into shreds of wood. Trees were uprooted and toppled onto homes and cars. The Chevron oil plant in town flooded. Damage was still heavy on Alabama's coastline. In Bayou Le Batre, the cargo ship MV Caribbean Clipper, alongside other boats, were thrown inland and into trees. Dolphin Island, which was hit hard by Ivan the year prior, was hit hard once again. Homes swept away by the high surge, and those that were still left standing were left uninhabitable. Surge was still high enough in Pascagoula to throw boats up and over the shore, and yet, the impacts were still felt further inland in places like Hattiesburg and Tylertown, Mississippi. The loss of power across the Jackson metro could not have happened at a worse time, as the heat wave came in behind the storm, leaving many without a key way to beat the heat. While deaths and damage statistics for areas outside of New Orleans are not readily available to my knowledge, we do know what it was in Mississippi and Alabama, vaguely. In NWS Jackson's area of responsibility, the total estimated damage is listed as approximately $7.4 billion. Insured property losses in Mississippi are listed at $9.8 billion. Damages in Alabama seem to be inconclusive, with the NCEI database listing damages at about $35.3 million. In Louisiana, insured property losses were estimated at $22.6 billion. NWS New Orleans did write regarding the cost of the damages. Uninsured and insured losses combined were estimated to exceed $100 billion across the Gulf Coast. The exact damage done per state isn't as clear as it is with more recent storms. Deaths in coastal Louisiana by county are rough to find. The Storm Events database lists 2 deaths in Lower Plaquemines Parish. How reliable that is, I cannot say for certain. Deaths in St. Bernard Parish stand at around 164. In Mississippi, 238 people were killed. For the coastal communities, there were 4 deaths in Pearlington, 4 in Lakeshore, 24 in Waveland, 20 in Bay St. Louis, 3 in Diamond Head, 1 in Killen, 25 in Pass Christian, 6 in Long Beach, 15 in Gulfport, 52 in Biloxi, 1 in the St. Martin community, 6 in the Gulf Hills community, 3 in Ocean Springs, 1 in the Gulf Park Estates, 2 in Pascagoula, with 3 missing, 2 in Harrison County, and 1 in Jackson County. 2 direct deaths are attributed to Alabama. Katrina is the deadliest storm to hit the direct coastline of Mississippi on record, and the death toll is staggering, even before taking New Orleans into account. Regardless of the damage, across the nation help eventually came into areas impacted, although it wasn't without its issues, primarily because of what happened in New Orleans. In the aftermath of such a disaster, an urgent response from local, state, and federal officials was needed. The biggest issue with the response was that communications were down pretty much everywhere. Goes without saying that when you have no real ways to communicate with the outside world, nobody could really get what they needed across to those with proper resources. State and local officials did what they could, but in terms of governmental frustration, most of it was aimed at the federal government, which is already well known. Many already know about the absolute mess that was the federal response to New Orleans. The absolute slow mess fueled by incompetence, a lack of preparation, and a complete and total failure of communication, with more fuel added onto the fire by media outlets throwing out baseless rumors because they needed something to put on the news. The focus quickly shifted from coastal Mississippi and Louisiana towards New Orleans, and that did play a part into how much initial aid came into the coastal parts of the region as a whole. Residents in some parts of Mississippi said they didn't see FEMA come into town until a week after the storm came through. However, most of the problems that were seen from the federal response outside of New Orleans were early on due to the entire communication system being down. There's so much to cover that it will have to be its own video. Most of the effort, at least in terms of the government, came from local leaders and officials. Mayors in multiple towns and cities along the Gulf Coast came out and showed that they were prepared for the crisis, as well as they could be anyway. The mayor of Bay St. Louis, Eddie Favre, or Bubba as he was called by residents, was referred to as the calm at the center of the storm. He stayed positive throughout, holding town hall meetings outside of temporary offices, keeping residents updated, fighting to preserve the character of his town, all while being able to joke about his loss. He did all of this wearing a pair of Bermuda shorts, promising to only wear shorts until the city was back, a promise he kept until his death. Although he did wear khaki pants once, but that was because he didn't want to offend the judge. Other mayors along the coast, Long Beach Mayor Billy Skelly, Gulfport Mayor Brent War, put an asterisk on Brent War because he did do something later that I do need to mention. Ocean Springs Mayor Connie Moran, Biloxi Mayor A.J. Holloway, and past Christian Mayor Chipper McDermott did everything they could to keep their residents up to date and informed, and do what they could to recover and bring some sense of normalcy to what looked like a battlefield. Although with past Christian that wasn't really the case at first. The mayor, when Katrina made landfall, Billy McDonald, was forced to resign after he had essentially stopped being the mayor, with Chipper McDermott replacing him. There's more to it than that, but I don't want this to go on forever. There's a really good BuzzFeed article on this by Joel Anderson that I recommend reading if you want to know more about that. Governor Barber's controversial status as a former lobbyist ended up being a crutch when it came to getting aid. With his connections, he was able to get Congress to approve billions for Katrina recovery, although at the expense of Louisiana. According to both residents and officials, it was complete outsiders who were the biggest helpers across the coast. Initially from people not associated with governmental agencies or massive charities, who came in about a week after the storm depending on the location. I want to talk about some of the specific groups, and this will vary in terms of time, so keep that in mind. In 2008, students from the University of Pennsylvania came to Pearlington as part of the Feldman Initiative, hosted by the Pearlington Recovery and Resource Center, providing social and medical services to residents. In Waveland, one of the biggest contributors to the recovery effort came from over 1,000 miles away, from the small town of Wayland, Massachusetts. The town of Wayland wanted to help New Orleans, but they soon wanted to focus on other towns that weren't being helped. The town that won was Waveland. The town of Wayland sent a tractor-trailer full of supplies to residents and FEMA trailers, and sent gifts to 125 families. Members on the Wayland and Waveland Steering Committee went to go visit multiple times. Another town, Hapeville, Georgia, adopted Waveland and donated supplies, with many residents who visited from Hapeville tearing up once they saw the devastation in person. In past Christian, it was the local community who stepped up, setting up items for people to pick up at the Lyle Elementary School. At Long Beach, 4 Girl Scouts from Massachusetts wanted to help restore the children's wing of the Long Beach Library, donating furniture and books. In Gulfport, the dolphins that went missing after they were swept from their aquarium home were rescued. Churches in Biloxi were a hotspot for residents to receive care. But for the most part, it was the community taking care of itself more so than anything. Neighbors helping neighbors, differences put aside so people could at least try and feel some semblance of normalcy. It was the communities hit the hardest, who did the hardest work. Long months laid ahead for the thousands upon thousands who were left with nothing, and many would soon come back stronger than before. But this begs the question, 2 decades later, how are the areas along the coast doing today? 20 years ago, the central Gulf Coast of the United States was changed forever. Hurricane Katrina, a storm which at its peak had winds of 175 miles per hour and a pressure of 902 millibars, slammed into the coastlines of Louisiana and Mississippi as a Category 3 hurricane, with an extremely low pressure of 920 millibars and 928 millibars at each landfall respectively. The end result? Catastrophic in a way that the United States hadn't seen in decades. The city of New Orleans was mostly underwater, but even outside of that area, the damage on the coastlines of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama were on such a scale that hadn't been seen since Hurricane Andrew in 1992, but that's being generous. At the time, there really was no comparison. The Mississippi River Delta, utterly devastated. Communities there from Burris Triumph to Venice to Boothville to many others were changed completely. And then, in Mississippi, the devastation was at such a scale that it looked more like the aftermath of a large tornado than by that of a hurricane. From one end of the coastline to the other, there was nothing but absolute devastation. Alabama was left in a similar state. Dolphin Island, hit hard by Ivan, devastated once more. Due to the devastation caused by Katrina in the United States, the name was retired and replaced by Cadia for use in the 2011, 2017, and 2023 Atlantic hurricane seasons. But how are the hardest hit areas doing today? Mainly the areas I've talked about in this video. Out of the states impacted, Louisiana has been a mixed bag. While the New Orleans metro has attempted to come back, it hasn't been so well off. The small towns along the Mississippi River have been unable to bounce back. While census data for most of these areas are unreliable or non-existent for 2005, based on the 2010 and 2020 census, the population in many of these locations in Plaquemines Parish have decreased over time. Empire's population was cut by nearly 55% in 2010 from its census estimate in 2000. A similar story appears across most of the hardest hit regions of the parish. While many towns split apart, the 20% decrease in population listed in the 2010 census was highly concentrated on the multiple small communities along the Mississippi River, mainly locations south of Biloxi, and especially for points south of Point Lahatchie. For those southern communities, it was made worse in 2010 with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, where oil from the disaster site made its home on the Mississippi River Delta. In the years immediately following Katrina, the only thing that seemed to keep the communities in rural Plaquemines Parish feeling somewhat okay was the love of high school football. But even then, that wouldn't make up for everything lost, or the only things left as shelter being FEMA homes. To say that southeastern Louisiana has had mixed results with rebuilding and coming back is an understatement. Big enough that I can't cover it all in this video. The state of Mississippi, on the other hand, has had a more successful rebuilding effort. The population on the coastline has rebounded, with the exceptions of Pearlington and Waveland. Pearlington was left in a rough spot. The damage done and poor management of the sewage system led to the whole water system having to be replaced. The cost needed to do that, alongside the funds needed to elevate homes to be within proper building codes, became too expensive for many to come back and return. In Waveland, the local Walmart reopened in November 2005, becoming the news sharing hub of the town, followed by a Lowe's in fall 2006. Businesses slowly started coming back too. The Buccaneer Bay Water Park in 2013 brought in shops and restaurants for those visiting. In 2013, what was the Waveland Civic and Cultural Center reopened as the Ground Zero Hurricane Museum, to remember the legacy of Katrina and to educate those visiting about hurricane safety and preparedness. The former popular Ricky's restaurant on Coleman Avenue finally reopened its doors for business on October 22nd, 2025, 20 years after Katrina. However, Waveland, just like Pearlington, is still struggling. High insurance costs and new building codes made it difficult for redevelopment to be as fast as the town wanted. The town's old business district on Coleman Avenue and homes nearby, while many have been rebuilt, the lack of trees and presence of empty foundations make it obvious that Katrina's scars are still etched deep into the town. In nearby Bay St. Louis, the population increased based on the census data between 2000 and 2010, despite the hurricane. Likely thanks in part to the leadership of its mayor, Eddie Favre. On May 24, 2007, the bridge connecting Bay St. Louis to Pass Christian was open once more, and businesses started to reopen as well, including the Hollywood Casino, which still remains a big part of the economy. People still continue to move in today, including one interesting individual in particular. Josh Morgerman, who many know as iCyclone, moved to Bay St. Louis building a hurricane house, where he lives to this day. Pass Christian struggled to get off of the ground initially, thanks in part to its mayor at the time, Billy McDonald, failing to meet the moment, eventually being forced out from City Hall. Chipper McDermott was elected as mayor after McDonald offered his letter of resignation, and soon the work started. The Walmart came back in 2009, causing sales tax revenue to triple. The population was 5,686 as of the 2020 census, and while it hasn't rebounded completely, it's doing much better than it was 10 years ago. Nearby Long Beach suffered from the OREC Corporation moving their vacuum plant to Tennessee, but the people didn't give up. The old senior center was transformed into a place for business. There was a casino planned to be built in town, but that seems like it still may be up in the air. Biloxi and Gulfport are now home to lavish resorts and casinos that are on land now instead of being out on the ocean. Businesses started to come back quickly, too. The Imperial Palace reopened in December 2005, Chimney's Bar on Christmas night 2009, the main post office in 2013, amongst many others. Recovery in this location was not without controversy. In 2008, Governor Haley Barbour announced plans to redirect $570 million given to the state to help low-income and middle-income residents who lost their homes in the storm to expand the port in Gulfport. The small craft harbor used $6.6 million of those funds. After a lawsuit, roughly $132 million of the funds were used to address housing needs, but most of the money went to the ports. And then there was Mayor Gregory Brent War. I may have said that his leadership was important at the time, but he soon ended up being arrested and pleaded guilty for stealing federal funds that were from FEMA. Even then, streets with empty foundations are still visible if you trek outside of the downtown areas. Ocean Springs 2, despite the hurdles, is doing alright all things considered. Pascagoula has been dealing with a housing crisis thanks in part to the FEMA floodplain map, and the resulting rise in housing insurance costs. Generally speaking, the coastline of Mississippi has stayed resilient and has mostly been able to bounce back from the storm. But even with Katrina gone, both Louisiana and Mississippi still had to deal with future storms. For every time that this region was beginning to make progress, it seemed like a storm was coming nearby just to make them start over again. Or at least try to. Hurricane Gustav in 2008 made landfall in southern Louisiana, bringing heavy rains across the state, and moderate storm surge of 10 feet in Bay St. Louis and 12 feet in Plaquemines Parish. Then, 7 years to the date after Katrina made landfall, Hurricane Isaac made landfall in Plaquemines Parish as a Category 1 hurricane. Despite the storm's weak strength, its large size and slow movement caused significant storm surge as water rushed inland through the Mississippi River, on top of heavy rainfall and flash flooding, thanks in part to over 10 inches of rainfall from Louisiana to the Mississippi-Alabama border. There was mostly a break for nearly the next decade with the small exception of Hurricane Nate, but most of those damages occurred in southwestern Alabama. Then there was 2020. Sadly heavily damaged portions of the Alabama coastline on the same day that Ivan made landfall back in 2004. And at the end of October, Hurricane Zeta made landfall in Louisiana as the first major hurricane to hit the southeastern coast of the state since Katrina, with the eye going directly over New Orleans itself. Damages in both Louisiana and Mississippi from Zeta are roughly $1.8 billion. But the big one was Hurricane Ida in 2021. The storm knocked power out to New Orleans and caused significant damage to the region. The water was flowing in reverse up the Mississippi River, with 14 feet of surge striking Plaquemines Parish. But since then, there really hasn't been much. 20 years later, those across the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama came together to remember the storm. Those in the country came back to remember what happened. But it was mostly about New Orleans, with it seeming like the only stories and documentaries coming out this year being focused on New Orleans. Sure, local news stations re-uploaded their old specials and new ones on the storm, but that isn't the same, and reinforces a point that led to this entire video being made, alongside for my reasoning as to why I want to completely remake the original Katrina video in this series. In basic conversation, or just in general, reporting on Katrina has been heavily skewed to those in New Orleans, with those hit hard outside of the city having this feeling of just being forgotten. From a historical perspective, the more populous and more significant area culturally when hit by the same disaster will be getting more attention. In this case, that was taken up to 11, as New Orleans practically became an island, most of it anyway, while the rest of the areas hit the hardest were just hit by typical hurricane damage. Extreme damage nonetheless, but in the journalism industry, money talks, and the bigger areas are gonna get more attention. But that doesn't mean that I think it's right. All suffering, no matter the kind or the extreme, is awful. Ignoring the stories and glossing over the impacts in the other areas hit by this storm is ignoring the other half of this storm's legacy. That's why I decided to cover Katrina again and go more in depth, and start that journey back of what I missed to cover the biggest mistake when I made my original video, which was to ignore the side on the coast. Making this video was me rectifying that, And hopefully there's something here that some haven't known before. Information that won't be forgotten. The people across coastal Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama were changed forever by this singular storm. And they will never forget the ferocious storm surge, the winds, the trauma, and the long road to recovery, and its impacts to those regions that last to this day. And I'll make sure to never forget what the storm did to the regions that were overshadowed by the humanitarian crisis in New Orleans. To make sure that this storm's legacy is talked about for all of the regions that were impacted. And I won't forget its impacts in coastal Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama anytime soon. But that crisis in New Orleans, I know everybody already knows a good majority of what happened there, but it shouldn't be ignored either. As I will talk about in the next episode in this little mini-series, the humanitarian catastrophe that followed in the great city of New Orleans was far worse than anyone could ever begin to imagine. A level of human suffering that is incredible by modern standards. Special thanks as always to my proofreaders, those being Foxtrot, Gamma Ray, and Griff, my channel artists Celtic White and Ann Berry for creating the VTuber model, FCX Animations for letting me use this icons, Blackbelt224 for creating the Katrina track animation, Zinel, Crackalick, and Cyanide Blue for letting me use their music whenever I use it, and everyone for watching, it means a lot. And I guess Rob Tuffer, the Geometry Dash level editor, for letting me create assets because, dear God, I do not want to use DaVinci Resolve. I want to give a few specific shoutouts, though. I put out a post asking for photos and footage from the areas I discussed in this video because I can't exactly go there myself right now given my whole living situation. I want to thank SharkNerd1011 and Siwa from my Discord server who provided me photos of the IP, and Siwa specifically for photos of the coast from the Darley Parton Bridge to the Gulfport port. I also want to thank Spencer who contacted me through email to offer footage from the Mobile area, but I ended up being good on that front in the end. I nearly forgot to mention this, but Tyler provided me with footage that his dad took on the coastline of Mississippi after it came through. I completely forgot about it until I was near the end of editing this video, and that's why that footage is at the end, but thank you to Tyler for providing that footage too. I can't thank them enough to a point where I'd probably run out of breath for saying thank you over and over again. Special thanks to those who are subscribed to the channel Patreon or our YouTube member. Those being Alan Boomer, Montpelier, and Phoenix at the Ulfi's Army tier, Altostradamus, Michelle, Tanner, Techno Idioto, and Worm Off the String at the Ulf Jr. tier, Bipolar Batty, Brian Hawley, Call of the Void, Dante DMC, David R, Devin Mychan, Esri, Foscrew, Foxtrot, Frank the Tank, Fry JC, Hannah Stormer, James Sullivan, Kara Kelly, King Shisa, Liz Suave, Means Beans Machines, Mama G, Rama, Southwest Florida Elevators, Tirane Rielta, and Van Granny at the Ulf Mini tier, and everyone listed on screen at the Ulf Supporter tier. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you want to support me financially and get access to behind-the-scenes stuff, please consider subscribing to the channel Patreon or becoming a member. It means a lot. I also plan on doing some pretty interesting stuff next year for it, and I hope to actually make it somewhat interesting. That's pretty much everything I have here. If you liked the video, consider subscribing to the channel for more stuff like this, alongside with the usual stuff, so liking, commenting, sharing around, all that jazz. I'm Alferia, you all have a great night, and I will talk to you all soon.